bunch.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you to today's Blue Pacific Futures webinar featuring the congressional delegation from the state of Hawaii. I'm enormously grateful to our representatives and senators for joining us for today's presentation. As you know, this Blue Pacific Futures webinar series is a collaboration between Georgetown University Center for Australia, New Zealand, and Pacific Studies and the Center for Pacific Island Studies at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. We're very pleased to be joined today by Senator Brian Schatz, Senator Mazie Hirono, Representative Ed Case, and Representative Kai Kahele. We were under a bit of time pressure. I have to say, I just had late notice that the Senate is scheduled a vote on the NDAA shortly. And given the busy schedule, what I'd like to do would be to forego an elaborate introduction to each one of our speakers. You saw their bios on the reservation page for today's event. And what I'd like to do would be to pitch to each one of the speakers and ask them to maybe just take a couple of minutes to talk a little bit about the way they see the Pacific Islands from the frame of Hawaii. And then I'll open up with a series of questions to our four panelists. And a word of warning, my screen is acting up a little bit. If for some reason suddenly I stop moving or I don't hear you, I just would ask just to go to the next speaker. Thank you so much. And so Senator Schatz, could we toss to you first? And just briefly, talk a little bit about Hawaii's interest in the Pacific Islands. Thanks.
Well, first of all, thank you for doing this, and thanks to all of the attendees. And it really is great to get the whole Hawaii Congressional delegation on this Zoom for this purpose. It kind of shows our collective commitment, not just to Hawaii as the headquarters of the Pacific Command and all of that, but for all of us as policymakers. We understand that our predecessor, my predecessor in particular, Daniel K. Inouye, understood his job to be someone who represented island nations throughout the Pacific region that didn't have representation in Congress. And so I'm pleased to be here on that basis. Let me give you 5 areas where I think the United States needs to do better. First, we need to treat island nations as nations in the context, especially of the climate crisis. Not as downstream from the impacts and decisions that are made in places like Glasgow and Paris and Bonn at all of these COP meetings, but rather full partners in the geopolitical sense. That's number one. Number 2 is that's all great and it's really critical, but they need help on the ground. There are runways that are being inundated. There are fresh water sources for drinking and for irrigation that are now being increasingly saline, and we need to help them fix what is happening in terms of climate change. We also have to work as hard as we can on vaccine diplomacy and the deployment of the vaccine as broadly and as deeply as we can. It's not enough to just touch every country with a few vaccines. We have to make this a real effort. And as you see the data, in particular Pacific Island nations, it does correlate with economic outcomes. And so we need to be aware that there are some nations that are doing really well and some nations that need a big push and a lot of help. Fourth, we need to tackle IUU fishing. This is an area where we can really collaborate with, for instance, Australia, New Zealand, the Philippines, South Korea, Japan, and others. Especially as we think about, so-called competition with China. It's not just a military buildup. It's also understanding that the assets of the Pacific are collective assets. They are commons and they should be protected on that basis. And finally, we need a long-term Pacific development finance strategy. We need to work with Australia, New Zealand, Japan, with the DFC, with USAID, with Coast Guard, with the State Department, to make sure that we can deploy private and public sector resources for economic development. So thank you for the opportunity.
Great. Thank you, Senator. Senator Hirono.
Well, just listening to Brian, he pretty much covered all of the areas that
I'm sorry.
I was going to. Yeah, well, can I leave now? I'm gonna go get a cup of coffee. Well, clearly our delegation works really well together because we, as an island state, we are very aware of the importance of the Pacific Island nations. And I think as a delegation, we pay due respect to the importance of our alliances throughout the Asia Pacific area. And as a member of the Armed Services Committee, of course, I am especially focused on some of the initiatives that we have that will build our alliances with the Pacific Island nations. And the fact that we can do and should be doing a lot more in terms of, for example, vaccination distribution that Brian talked about. But we also have other initiatives that involve military exercises, the biggest being RIMPAC, which involves over 24 countries from the Asia Pacific area. And so all of the alliances that we have in this part of the world is part of what I consider the asymmetric advantage that we have over China, because China is our biggest competitor. And China has been very busy in our part of the world with their Belt and Road Initiative as they seek to really expand their influence, not just in our part of the world, but in Africa and other places. And they are in there with a whole of government approach to island nations. They're building hotels, they're building up reefs and all of that. And so China is very intent on expanding their influence in our part of the world. And so it makes it even more important that initiatives such as the Pacific Defense Initiative that would really focus our assets and resources to the Asia Pacific area. When we have something like PDI, it is really important that we don't just say, well, that's a nice thing to recognize the importance of this part of the world, but we actually have to put resources here. And in that regard, it became pretty clear that the Department of Defense had not put enough of the kind of attention and resources that we would like. And so there was a mismatch. And I have joined with Senator Sullivan in the NDAA to have language that requires the DoD to make sure that we are actually aligning resources with the importance of this part of the world. And island nations that where so much of their economy is dependent on fishing, it is really important that our country works with them to help them with the illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing. And so the kind of programs that we have to train them to interdict not just illegal fishing, but human trafficking and drug trafficking, the kind of partnering that we can do and training we can do through the Coast Guard, for example, is the kind of practical kinds of things that we can do. And I want to close by talking about the importance of the compact that we have with with Micronesia, Palau, and Marshall Islands. And these compacts are very important to our national security, but I don't think that as a nation we provide enough resources and enough in terms of the kind of partnering we can do to help them with their infrastructure needs, et cetera, to acknowledge how important these compacts are. And we are in the process of renegotiating these compacts, very important to our national defense. And so this is the kind of area that I point out to the military brass, starting from the Department of Secretary of the DoD, and making sure that we are acknowledging and providing resources to our island nation friends in the Asia Pacific area. So we all sit on different committees. You probably know that, Alan, and part of the reason for that is that we all very much in the committees that we are on pay attention to what's going on in our part of the world, and of course to represent Hawaii strongly. And I want to mention, of course, thank you Georgetown University and the University of Hawaii and all the students from that are on this program. But I happen to be, I think I'm the only graduate of both these schools, so there. Yes. So mahalo nui loa for all of the research and the good works that both of these programs do. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Senator. Mr. Case, I feel like I've got to know you very, very well through this little tiny box of Zoom, but it's great to see you again. And I know that you've been a leader in putting together the Pacific Island Caucus in the House, and I'd love to hear your introductory comments.
Thank you so much, Alan, and thank you for all of your involvement in the Pacific Islands for so long. I mean, all of us have relied on you in one way or another, and I'm really happy to be part of this. And I think, as Brian I think said, the fact that all four of us are on this call all attests to our interest in the Pacific Islands. I do. You know, of course, this is all extremely topical on many different levels, from China to climate changes, as Senator Schatz mentioned, and Mazie speaking to many of our efforts in the defense part of it. And we've seen firsthand our Pacific Island leaders stepping forward again on the world stage in the last couple of months at the United Nations and at COP26, especially on the issue of climate change, where they have been the world leaders for decades now. This is an existential threat for them, and it's gratifying in one way to finally have them be a little bit more listened to along these lines. But of course, we have to take action at this point. I guess I would also note at the outset that in the Pacific, we are all one ohana, or family. For those that are not familiar with that word, and I think it's comparable in New Zealand. And anytime there is, dislocation and unrest anywhere in the Pacific, it's of concern to all of us. So, I certainly wish the Solomon Islands the very best in working out what is happening there right now. That's a concern for everybody, and we wish them very well. I appreciate your mentioning our Pacific Islands Caucus, because really, one of my observations coming back to Congress was that at a time when the importance of the Pacific generally and the Pacific Islands in particular. So when I'm talking here about the Pacific Islands, I'm not talking so much about the rim countries, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, et cetera, but I'm talking about the actual Pacific Island jurisdictions, 25 or so jurisdictions, independent countries, territories, departments of some countries freely associated, but all really with a common culture and a common way of going about life, and common challenges, from climate change to geographic isolationism to difficulties in developing a broad range of economic activities, and thus particular exposure to pandemics such as COVID, that of course we know have been tremendously damaging to many of our Pacific Island countries and jurisdictions. And that was one of the reasons why we did form the Pacific Islands Caucus a few years back in Congress, where I and other members who felt strongly that we needed a better centralized focus out of the U.S. House of Representatives on the Pacific Islands, got together on a bipartisan basis and formed our Pacific Islands Caucus, which now has a couple dozen members to it, including the leaders of many of the committees of jurisdiction and subcommittees of jurisdiction. Tremendously well received by the Pacific Islands themselves. We've worked with you and other scholars. We've worked with pretty much all of the embassies on actually turning our focus into legislation, of which the primary vehicle is the Blue Pacific Act, which basically stands for boosting long-term U.S. engagement in the Pacific. It's designed really to direct, to magnify and accelerate and diversify our own foreign aid and assistance to the countries and islands of the Pacific. It's not focused on the defense side. There's a whole bunch of other stuff going on there. Mazie spoke to the Pacific Deterrence Initiative. That's invaluable from that perspective. But the Blue Pacific Act aims at humanitarian, at security assistance to illegal fishing, which both of the senators spoke to, really on a coordinated basis. This has been lacking in our public policy for a while now. And that Blue Pacific Act is moving along just fine in the House. It's now part of the broader Eagle Act. It also has elements from bills that the two U.S. senators here have worked on and have sent over to us from the Senate. And we're really hoping that once the Senate figures out the NDAA, we'll turn back to we have to figure it out, private inside joke, but that we will also turn back to the engagements with the Pacific that we are aiming at whether they be the Blue Pacific Act or others. I guess I would mention just really briefly in my time remaining, back to I think your original question was, where does Hawaii fit into all of this? Obviously in Hawaii, we fit into this in innumerable ways. And of course, Indo-PACOM being located in Hawaii and the strategic location of Hawaii has a lot to do with it. But anybody that thinks that that's kind of the end of it is making a huge mistake. And I think most of us understand that in the Pacific. We of course, come from a common culture, and whether we're ethnically Pacific or not, we are still of that culture. We still think that way. We are still able to, I guess what I would say, provide cultural translation between the Pacific Islands and our country and perhaps other countries in the ways that we navigate Washington, D.C. We certainly have some of the leading institutions in the world on the Pacific in Hawaii, whether it be the East-West Center or the Asia-Pacific Center for Security Studies, or the University of Hawaii itself, or other institutions where world-class work is being done on the Pacific Islands, and where many of the leaders of the Pacific Islands have been educated and still are educated. And so, it's more than just a saying that in Hawaii we really are in many ways our country's at least a center of the Pacific, and that's a role that we welcome and relish, but we need to turn that into action. Back to you.
Great, thank you. Mr. Kahele, we wonder if we could get your views on Hawaii's place in the Pacific Islands.
Hey, Alan, thanks so much. And it's great to be here with all of you, and mahalo nui loa for inviting me to this, Georgetown, University of Hawaii Blue Pacific Futures discussion. I get to go last, junior member of the delegation. Many of my colleagues have already touched on a lot of really important things for the Pacific, but I'm excited to be here in the Congress to represent Hawaii. I'm proud that Hawaii has sent a Native Hawaiian back to the United States Congress, following in the big, hard to fill sometimes shoes of Senator Akaka. But I am proud that the state of Hawaii and the East-West Center host this Pacific Islands Conference, and that this year a number of critical regional priorities are being discussed. Things are really important to the delegation: climate change and the impacts on our Pacific Island nations, COVID-19 and helping those nations get through the pandemic recovery, connecting the digital connectivity between the Pacific and infrastructure development, marine resources development and conservation, especially as it has to do with Papahanao, Mokuakea, Northwest Hawaiian Islands, some of our fisheries in the Western Pacific, and the 2050 strategy for the Blue Pacific continent that I know our Pacific leaders are developing. Pacific leaders, Alan, have contributed greatly to U.S. national security and prosperity, and our exclusive access to military testing ranges in our COFA countries are critical for the national defense of our country. Pacific Islanders, like myself, who serve in the Hawaii National Guard, serve in the U.S. military at a disproportionately higher rate. But historically, this population has often been overlooked and treated unfairly in many cases. As we wind down 20 years of war in the Middle East and counterterrorism operations, and we pivot to the Pacific, and given the current security environment and increased attention to China, this region is finally getting the attention it deserves. Senator Hirono and myself both serve on our respective Armed Services Committee, and that allows me to be a strong supporter of the Pacific Deterrence Initiative, which is planned to invest almost $5 billion into vital military capabilities in the Pacific to deter China in the Pacific region in the FY22 Defense Appropriations Bill. Everything from the TACMAR over-the-horizon radar in Palau to the Homeland Defense radars in Hawaii and Guam. There's a lot of really important things that need to be done in the Pacific for us to be able to position ourselves to stay ahead of that pacing threat, which is China. On the other side, I'm a proud member of the Pacific Islands Caucus, which Congressman Case talked about in the U.S. House. I'm a co-sponsor of the Blue Pacific Act, boosting long-term U.S. engagement in the Pacific. And this bill, like he mentioned, will significantly expand U.S. engagement in the Pacific Islands region and provide almost $1 billion in U.S. assistance for the Pacific Islands region over the next 5 fiscal years. Just a few weeks ago, we had a chance to meet with the president of Palau and his delegation. We are and have conveyed to the administration how important it is that we come to the table and negotiate in good faith and come to an agreement before these agreements expire with our FAS and our COFA states. And it's really important for us to do that. And we had a chance to meet with the President Palau and his delegation, and everything from security issues in the region, illegal fishing, human and narcotics trafficking, unlicensed mineral exploitation and pollution. These are all things that are really important that we need to talk about, and I'm hoping this administration does that. We've encouraged this administration to appoint as quickly as possible an Assistant Secretary for Insular Affairs in the Department of Interior that is still unfilled. So that person can be the belly button for DOI in the Pacific. We've also advocated for a special envoy designee to lead these negotiations that are really important to Palau and our smaller Pacific Island nations. But again, mahalo, Alan, for having myself and the rest of the delegation here. And thanks so much. And I really appreciate it. Aloha.
Thank you very much. Your comments are very much appreciated. I wonder if I could, several of you have mentioned the COFA states and negotiations on the next negotiations for the compact states. And I know that the relationship between Hawaii as a destination for many citizens of FSM, Marshall Islands, and Palau, that there's a strong relationship there. I was wondering if I could get you to talk a little bit about Hawaii and as a destination for COFA citizens, and maybe talk a little bit more deeply about some of the challenges that COFA states face. It seems to me that the vaccine diplomacy has worked very nicely. But there are still some serious challenges, and we have the problem of Pacific regionalism, and Pacific regionalism seems to have been dented by the last round of elections for the Secretary General of the Pacific Island Forum. So I was just wondering if I could just sort of tease out from you a little bit, a few other comments about the U.S. relationship with the COFA states, what the U.S. could do to encourage the renewal of Pacific regionalism, and address some of those challenges that exist in the funding of the compacts. And that's for whoever wants it.
I think that the two of us who are members of our respective Armed Services Committee are very aware of the importance of the compacts, but the challenge is that I don't think that too many others of our colleagues understand the importance of these island nations to us, and that these compacts are so important that their citizens can come to any state without the need for a visa. And this is why, especially during the pandemic, it became very clear that the Hawaii and Guam host more compact citizens than any other places. There are some in Guam, and there are some, Arkansas, I believe, and some other areas, but this is not a population that is necessarily acknowledged. But during the pandemic, it was clear a lot of them were in the front lines, working in meatpacking plants and all of that. And that is why I am very aware of the need for advocacy on our part to let everyone know that as we negotiate these compacts, that we provide more resources to these island nations, because of course they have education issues, they have economic issues, they have healthcare issues. And one of them, as far as I'm concerned, one of the major things that we did to help the compact citizens was to enable them to qualify for Medicaid. This is a qualification that was taken away from them during the Clinton, as part of the Clinton so-called welfare reform. And it took us literally 10 years to restore that eligibility to them. And so we also have a bill to enable them to access some of the other social network programs, social underpinning programs that they should have. But it's a pretty challenging road to hoe, wouldn't you say, my colleagues?
Yeah, let me just add a couple of things. Obviously the sort of top line is we have to renegotiate the Compact of Free Association. That's obvious. Let me make a couple of observations. It's not just bases. And I think the challenge is that the Department of Defense understandably thinks in terms of, being forward and having access and being operational in the region. That's a reasonable aspect of our relationship, but we do need to think of our relationship as a relationship with sovereigns, right? Not wards of the state, not folks who need assistance, but other countries, other nations, other cultures, other sovereigns. And I think the reason that I think it's so important that we talk in those terms is that I've never seen so much racism in Hawaii as I have with our FSM brothers and sisters. And that is something that I think all of us collectively have a responsibility to fight against. It's just historically true that whoever is the most recent immigrant group usually gets picked on, but that doesn't make it any more right. And that's something that I think we have a collective obligation to fight against, especially given Hawaii's, not a perfect history, but a better history of integrating various cultures into our melting pot.
Mhm.
I think I would, I want to amplify everything that my colleagues just said. I mean, focusing just on the COFA countries just for now. Of course, the challenges that the Pacific Islands face are economic, healthcare, education, and it is completely natural for folks to want to seek a better life and a better place. And of course, those countries' challenges is to try, and our challenge is to try to help them to provide that life in the countries of origin for those that want to stay there. The compacts have been incredible agreements for our country and for their countries all around. Places like Hawaii have been asked to bear a disproportionate burden for that. And we're talking about in the hundreds of millions of dollars a year of uncompensated federally required services. And that's why Mazie's efforts on Medicaid were incredibly valuable, and it's unfinished business. And what Brian says is exactly right. There's a tremendous cultural dislocation that comes from leaving your island homes in the Pacific and moving to Honolulu or Wellington or Auckland or anywhere else, or for that matter. And we know that we now have larger populations of Pacific Islanders from some countries in our countries than are in the countries of origin to start with. The other side of it is it's really exciting to see the development of these communities in Hawaii and elsewhere into real generations of involvement and influence and advancement across the board. I know that each of us has had that experience. I've had interns from the Pacific Islands in my office. I've nominated them to our service academies. They're going to be leaders of our military at the upper ranks. I'm positive of that. And so we've got to keep that going. So I think, from our perspective, we are all focused on moving those compacts along as fast as possible. What Congressman Kaeli spoke to is exactly right. We don't frankly think this administration is giving them sufficient focus yet and sufficient advancement on a quick enough basis. And that's what they want. And that's what we think they should want. And we want it too. So that's part of all of our effort. I want to talk just briefly to your comment on Pacific regionalism, because I think this is really a real challenge for the Pacific right now. The Pacific Islands Forum has served very, very well from that perspective to bring the Pacific Island jurisdictions and countries together to try to think of the Pacific in a collective sense, as opposed to individual, and to work together collectively on climate change or economic development or any other number of things. And, obviously, some of our competitors, particularly China, would love that regionalism to fail. If they can't dominate it, they'd rather divide and conquer. And I think that we have to be very practical and very realistic about that. So that the current challenge to the forum is of great concern to me. And I very much hope that they work it out. Now, it's their forum. It's not our forum. And, we don't want to dictate what they should or shouldn't do. But I certainly hope and believe and encourage that be worked out, because the failure of the forum, I think, would be a big setback for the Pacific.
Yeah, Alan, I'll just chime in. I look at it real simply, right? The COFA states are ours to lose, the United States to lose, and that would be devastating to our country on a number of fronts. The Pacific Island region is very dynamic. It changes every day. China is on that doorstep every day, and in many times it's changing, not necessarily in the United States' favor. You look at Micronesia, who's withdrawn from the Pacific Islands Forum, and statements made by this administration, where the Secretary of State, in testifying that these negotiations are a priority. Those are his own words, but there have been no meaningful negotiations or conversations that have happened, at least publicly, that I know about since then. When we look at like what Senator Schatz talked about, I live on Hawai'i Island, out in Ocean View, going towards my, ancestral home of Miloli'i, is a large community there in Ocean View of Micronesians and different Pacific Island communities there. And there's a generational trauma that these communities have had to endure because of nuclear testing and things that we've done a long time ago. So when you look at Brunet Dome and the United States responsibility to make sure that radioactive material is housed safely, that's something that we got to address. And so it's about relationships. It's about that marriage and nurturing that, and having the right opportunity and negotiating opportunities with these countries. And what we don't want to do is have these agreements expire or take it took over 7 years for these agreements in the case of Palau. And then you get into a fight of who's paying for it. And you get Congress got to come in and pay for it. And then it's discretionary dollars versus mandatory dollars. And what kind of message are we sending when it's funded via discretionary dollars? So that's just my thoughts. That it's ours to lose.
Thank you so much. I'm just curious then, we had a question from Greg Brown at Georgetown University, and and many have mused over the past few years about the United States or others extending compacts of free association with Kiribati, for instance. And I'm assuming that given the comments that I've heard here today, that wouldn't be very high on your priority. Would that be safe to say, or is there room to countenance expanding the compacts of free association to other Pacific Island countries?
Well, I guess I've never thought about it, and so it's a worthy thought. I mean, we want to strengthen our engagement and relationships in the Pacific. The compacts are one of our relationships and engagements that happens to have a historic basis to it in the old trust territory of the Pacific Islands, which did not, correct me if I'm wrong, academic scholars did not include Kiribati. And so, but I guess I don't react against it on a no basis. I guess maybe what I react to it on is on the basis of we need to get these compacts done and right again for 10 years. Now, Kiribati is, of course, as we all know, a major issue right now because first of all, it's the closest to us in Hawaii and on a number of ways, and yet it certainly has had more engagement with China and China vice versa than many of the other Pacific Islands. So it's something we ought to be concerned about, and we ought to be focused on engagement with Kiribati in particular.
Could I just come in on the back of that? This kind of raises for me, and several of you have mentioned China quite pointedly, and I'm just curious, are there downsides for really having a China-centric approach to the Pacific Islands in American foreign policy? I mean, today, if I were to ask someone from overseas, can you describe U.S. foreign policy towards the Pacific Islands? I think what I would get would be there's concern about China, and the driving force is China. But is there a downside to that?
Yes, absolutely. And it's sort of maddening. Look, I understand that that we need access to bases and installations, and we want partners in the military and geopolitical sense. But a Pacific strategy has to do with the Pacific and not solely with our only near peer adversary. That's a factor, but it can't be the only one, because I think what happens then is that the DoD drives all of the strategy, and it becomes a matter of war preparation, rather than using all of the tools in our toolkit in terms of diplomacy and soft power and economic and cultural influence. And our greatest strength in addition to the world's greatest military, is that people like us and they do not enjoy getting bullied. And so just the fact that Tony Blinken is doing, by Zoom, these bilats, just the fact that these nations are being treated like nations again is central to our strategy, because the way America leads is by being the indispensable nation. And that is not just a matter of, well, if it ever got kinetic, we would win, because the truth is, if it ever got kinetic, sure, we would win, but everybody would lose. And so the point here is to create peace and prosperity in the region. And the way to do that is economic partnerships, disaster prep, climate adaptation, investment, vaccine diplomacy, managing our natural resources together. That's the way that we dominate this Pacific century, but we do so in a way where it's not just purely martial and who's got more carriers and carrier groups and better, radars and bombs. We will always win that battle, but that's a heck of a way to prepare for the Pacific century. And I think it's really important that this not get driven exclusively by the DoD and by defense contractors who benefit from more and more equipment.
I'd like to.
Sorry.
Oh,
Hi.
go ahead, Senator.
Just very briefly, China has a whole of government approach. It's not just their military assets, which we're not going to, in terms of sheer numbers, they have more planes, more ships, more assets, military assets. So clearly we're not going to compete that way. China has a whole of government approach, which includes economic and the soft power, all of that. And that's the kind of long-term approach that we need to take. China is definitely a near-peer competitor, not just in the military arena, but in the economic area. And right, I agree with you, Brian, that we shouldn't look at China as the enemy as such, but it just goes to show that we have to really refocus on the alliances that we have throughout this part of the region. That includes Japan, that's New Zealand, that's Australia, that's South Korea, India, and our alliances are where our power, I think, lies. And that's why I refer to our alliances as our asymmetric advantage in this part of the world, as well as basically throughout the world. And I must say that during the Trump years, our allies really wondered where the heck we were. And now, we have, they're still wondering what is going to be our fate. But I very much support a whole of government approach to our dealings with China.
Thanks, Alan. I agree with both Senator Schatz and Hirono's comments. Beyond the economic piece, another way to look at this as well is how the United States can step up in terms of economic partnerships and investments. And one of the most important things is education. We know that education is, very, very important when, developing an economy and developing communities and strong families. The United States, through the universities that we have, can partner with many of these Pacific Island nations to further their educational advancement. For example, Penn State University uses technology to extract water from the air. And, when we're talking climate adaptation and salt tolerant crops and wind, solar, wave power production, traditionally Pacific Islands have always had ways to be climate resilient and have climate adaptation and mitigation things that they do. So I think there's an important role for the educational component throughout the Pacific Island nations, where universities can play an important role in the innovation that can help this, particular region of the world.
Yeah, the fact is that you can't talk about the Pacific Islands without talking about China, and you can't only talk about China, and you can't only talk about everything but China. It really has to be all of the above. And so without as Mazie was saying, a coordinated policy that reaches across all aspects of our government, we're not going to get this right. And I think we are getting it right, by the way. So I'm not fearful of it. But put yourself in the situation in the Pacific Islands. I mean, you don't want us to be interested in you just because of some geopolitical competition between the U.S. and China. But you're also caught in a very realistic challenge of basic. How do you provide for your nation? How do you provide for your infrastructure? How do you provide for education and healthcare and a whole range? And so the lesson there is China is perfectly willing and able and capable of providing all of the above. It's just that they're not providing it out of a selfless motivation. They have their goals, and so if we're not stepping up to that plate on across the board, we leave these nations with very few choices, and they don't want to be in that situation, and we don't want them to be in that situation. So we have to talk realistically about China, but if that's all we're talking about, that's a huge mistake, as Senator Schatz said.
Thank you very much. As everyone would acknowledge, the Pacific Islands have been very much in the news in the past few days with the uprise of some violence in Honiara in the Solomon Islands. And there have been accusations floating around that the United States and Taiwan have somehow acted to in fact incentivize through financial contributions to Malaysia, the region, the province in the Solomon Islands, that's created some discord there amongst the local population. And so, rather than get stuck into the Solomon Islands, how can we ensure that with the Blue Pacific Act or with Senator Schatz's the Honoring Oceania Act, how can we ensure that we are planning our spending and conducting our spending in a way that is mindful of, quite frankly, some of the fragility that one finds in the Pacific Islands, small, conflict-sensitive, climate-sensitive regions that are facing numerous economic challenges. So I was wondering if anyone would like to talk a little bit about how we ensure that we spend our money wisely, and not just in an accounting sense back to the United States in terms of accountability, but how do we spend it wisely in the Pacific Islands?
I'll take a swing at that, and I apologize if I'm going to stay at the kind of 30,000 foot level, but I will just observe that at least on the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate, members have incredible granular understanding of Eastern and Western Europe and all of Africa and Central Asia and the Middle East. And when it comes to the Pacific, if you talk about going, doing a CODEL, a congressional trip to the Middle East, people can't even picture in their mind's eye how far away certain places are from other places, right? Like, I led a CODEL to the Philippines, Japan, and Korea, and someone said, "Well, can we add in India?" I said, "Well, not without a few extra days, right?" And it's just an observation that otherwise really knowledgeable people who understand leaders in exile, the status of the legislative body, the status of press freedom, economic indicators, think of the Pacific as the thing in between CONUS and China. And so I think it starts with the oversight level for us to demand that level of expertise and sensitivity. And then I think that flows into the State Department's work and all the agencies that the State Department either works with or funds.
Yes, I'd agree that the awareness of this part of our part of the world is very, very much not exactly there. And this is why I would say that our work is really important to continue to call attention to this part of the world. But it's also not just the island nations, but it's all the surrounding countries that we need to engage with. And during the Trump years, the State Department was hollowed out, and so we didn't have the kind of presence in all of the island nations, not to mention our major allies such as Japan and the other nations. So I really, part of it is that we have to continue to call attention, and that's where your programs matter. And that's where the East-West Center matter. I would say that these programs need to attain a higher profile. we can probably, look to you folks for more help, because I would venture to say that there aren't that many people who know that Georgetown and University of Hawaii even has these kinds of programs that very much focus on what's going on in the Asia Pacific area. So, there's a lot of attention building that we need to engage in, and clearly Ed's caucus is another critical area. And if we can get some of this legislation passed, sure. But in order to, in my view, to get this legislation passed, other people have got to figure out, oh, this is important. We should pay attention. We should enact these pieces of legislation. This is why, in my view, something as critical as simply allowing compact citizens to get Medicaid coverage took so god darn long. Shouldn't have been like that. But we shall plug away. I know we are. And I think with our continuing banging on the State Department and the DOD, with maybe a higher profile for programs like yours, it will help.
Yeah,
Senator, thank you. Oh, sorry. Please go ahead.
Well, I'm
Case, go
just saying, I think, sometimes we can overcomplicate this. I mean, first of all, as you asked, how can we get to the Pacific Island nations the aid that they need? Well, first of all, we ask them, number one, and then sometimes in our history we have decided what others need, whether they needed it or not, rather than ask them and then help them with that. And I think I think we're on the right track in terms of the Pacific Islands, but we can always listen and better. Number one, and number two, it's not rocket science what is needed. It's basic infrastructure, it's economic development and sustainment. It is the basic social infrastructure of education and healthcare. Areas and needs that perhaps we tend to take for granted here a little bit sometimes. And so these, as you know, are with one or two exceptions, small countries with very small populations. And so it doesn't, you can make a huge impact in a very quick period. And the legislation that we're all working on the Pacific Islands right now is essentially, in so many words, trying to do the same thing on the non-defense side of our aid as the Pacific Deterrence Initiative is trying to do on the defense side, where we're trying to say to our defense effort, hey, you have to focus on the Pacific, and you have to have sources of funding that can be relied upon over time, that are going to go to the Pacific, not get siphoned off somewhere else in the establishment. And so it is. I don't think the needs are complicated, but the focus takes a while, and the dedication over time takes sustained effort.
Let's see.
Thank you very much. I'm just reminded of the comment of Robert Underwood. I didn't know if you remember, Bob, but he was the president of the University of Guam and the former delegate from Guam in Congress, and he came to Georgetown and gave the Peter Talley Coleman speech, and it was a wonderful speech. And I said to him at the end, I said, "Tell me a little bit about the reception of your colleagues about the Pacific Islands. Was there interest in Congress?" And it was the only time I saw Bob frown. And he said he was really disappointed that other members simply weren't curious. And I found that tremendously saddening. And I hope that all of you can help encourage that kind of curiosity and wanting to know amongst your colleagues. Professor Kabutalaka from the University of Hawaii, my colleague in putting together these events, has just made the observation that the U.S. through USSP scholarship offers 3 scholarships per year to students in the South Pacific. China offers hundreds of scholarships. Is there any opportunity to increase scholarships? And I think this goes to the broader question about people-to-people connections between the peoples of the Pacific and the mainland U.S., and also deepening the understanding, the intellectual understandings between peoples of the Pacific and people here in the 50 states. And I was wondering if anyone would like to comment on that.
Well, I'd say that these kinds of educational exchanges are really critical. And there was a time, you probably know, and I don't know the exact name of the initiative, but it was to enable hundreds of students from China to come to our country to study. And there was an actual focus program. I went to a reception to that, and all that's out the window now, because anytime you mention China, you have people like Tom Cotton and others just jumping up and down, trying to make sure that we have no engagement at any level with China, which is a mistake. So I'm sure that your programs, have identified different things that we can do to shore up these kinds of engagements, but at the moment, I am not particularly aware. We have sister state relationships. I think there's some exchanges that can occur, but I am open to ideas that you all have. And by the way, I just was looking at the screenshot that, look at our delegation. We have the most diverse delegation in the entire Congress, wouldn't you say? Because I mean, I am an immigrant, I'm a Japanese, you have a Jewish person, senator, you have the Caucasian person there, and then you have a Native Hawaiian. My gosh, isn't that incredible?
I've never been referred to that way, Mazie, the
What,
Caucasian
the
person.
Caucasian person? When you're the white guy. I say that with affection, so what the heck.
Taken in that spirit.
Of course.
Let me just add one thing. The East-West Center is a gem. And a couple of good pieces of news about the East-West Center. Susie Veras Lum was just appointed as the new president. She's going to be extraordinary.
Yep.
For the first time, the East-West Center was, well, for the first time in a long time, was not zeroed out in the president's budget. So it doesn't have to be fought for in the appropriations process. We can try to plus them up, but we don't have to fight back from zero. And finally, they really are focusing on climate action, climate adaptation, with a particular focus on the Pacific Islands. So while other programs have shrunk, I think the East-West Center, continues to do extraordinary work. And everybody knows heads of state throughout the Asia Pacific region are alumni of various programs and opportunities at the East-West Center.
Well, I'm so happy you mentioned the new president of the East-West Center. She's fantastic. So
yes.
Yeah.
And in my conversation with her, I said, yes, we all agree that the East-West Center is a gem, but not very many people know what really they do and the kind of influence that they can have throughout this part of the world. And I just want to mention that all of us have various bills that will really focus on this part of the world. But I actually have a bill that Senator Menendez is leading, and it's called the Insular Area Climate Change Act, to provide U.S. territories and the freely associated states financial and technical support for climate change planning, mitigation, adaptation, and resilience efforts. So here's a guy from New Jersey who's taking an interest, which is progress.
That's tremendous. That's tremendous. That's great outreach. Perhaps we're coming up just to the last couple of minutes, because I know that there is a vote scheduled in the Senate at 6 o'clock, and I really appreciate you hanging around as you have that vote looming. But this is an opportunity perhaps just for some concluding remarks. I'd love to hear from the panel about whether you see there's an opportunity for the United States to deepen and expand its diplomatic connection to the Pacific Islands. We rely so heavily on countries like Australia and New Zealand for engagement in Melanesia and in parts of Polynesia. Is that something we should continue to do, or should we develop our own relationships? Love to hear your comments.
In short, yes.
Okay.
And I'm actually going to answer this slightly differently. I don't know the answer to that. And I think it's pretty consequential thing. And I'm not sure whether we should have our own. It sounds good to have our own direct lines of communication, but relationships are tricky, and trying to establish your own new line of communication may subvert the existing relationship kind of ecosystem. And so I just don't know.
Yeah.
I think the answer is yes myself. I think that if you go out into the Pacific Islands and talk to them, they will say to you that the way we've approached the Pacific Islands, where the United States has focused more on Micronesia for all kinds of reasons, obviously, than perhaps some of the other Pacific Rim countries in Australia, on Melanesia and New Zealand, on Polynesia, even though Hawaii and New Zealand are both Polynesia, has had both benefits and downsides. The benefits obviously have been focus and coordination and maximization perhaps of assistance. The downside is that some of the parts of the Pacific would like to continue that relationship, but would also like the other countries to participate as well. In other words, that the United States, for example, should show up more in Papua New Guinea or the Solomon Islands for that matter. And we had a very interesting thing that just happened in Palau, which of course is part of Micronesia, where Australian military were embedded in a Marine Corps exercise by our country in Palau. And that made huge news in Palau that Australians were there as well as United. And so I think there's room for improvement. I think, and speaking directly to the United States, the diplomatic side did suffer over the last years, where we were pulling out the Peace Corps and closing consulates and doing other stuff. And what message does that send if you the Peace Corps, one of the most invaluable things we've done for generations from a U.S. Outreach to the rest of the world, gets pulled out of a country in the Pacific Islands? What are they to make of that? And consulates, just basic consular presence and function, that's also invaluable to many of these countries, especially handling the traveling back and forth. And so these are small steps that we can take to regain our the refrain that you sometimes hear from many parts of the Pacific, which is all you really have to do is show up a little bit more and help us out with the things that we need help with, but you got to show up first. And so I think that's fair criticism for us, and it's something that we should fix and can fix.
Totally agree with my colleague, Congressman Case. The United States needs to show consistent presence, in the region, in these areas. One of the things that we do, not to, keep talking on the military side of the house, but through our National Guard, we have many states throughout the country, including Hawaii, that have vital, critical state partnerships with many of these countries. Wisconsin has a state partnership with Papua New Guinea, and the Adjutant General of Wisconsin works together with his mirror image in Papua New Guinea. And they just don't do military exercises. They do humanitarian and disaster relief exercises. They provide economic support, education, and those relationship building opportunities. Hawaii is Indonesia and the Philippines, but throughout the entire Pacific, you have valuable relationships and state partnership programs with defense attaches in these smaller island nations. And, that's something that I think we do the best we can. We could use more funding for it, but it is what it is. But, I do agree that we need to show a consistent presence, and there's a lot more that we can do.
Well, I want to thank the four of you for joining us, Mr. Kahele, Mr. Case, Mr. Schatz, and Mrs. Hirono. I thank you so much for your time. What a wonderful presentation. And it was great to see some graduates of Georgetown University and the University of Hawaii at Manoa. It's great. Thank you all so much. All the best.
Aloha,
Bye-bye.
everyone. Mahalo nui loa.
Aloha. Mahalo.